This is the true account of the Lions of Njombe, a pride of approximately 15 lions that terrorized southern Tanzania between 1932 and 1947, killing as many as 500 people in what remains the deadliest outbreak of man-eating lions in recorded history. The story endures not merely for its scale of human tragedy, but because it represents the collision between ancient beliefs and colonial intervention, between the natural world disrupted by human interference and the deadly consequences that followed. In the remote highlands of what was then Tanganyika, a perfect storm of ecological disaster, traditional superstition, and administrative negligence created conditions for carnage that would span 15 years and 3 generations of killer lions. In the 1930s, the Njombe district stretched across the southern highlands of Tanganyika like a vast tableland carved from the earth itself. The region rose dramatically from the surrounding lowlands to heights of nearly 2,000 meters above sea level, creating a landscape of rolling hills, scattered forests, and sweeping grasslands that caught the mountain winds and held them in perpetual motion. The air was thin and cool, a sharp contrast to the sweltering heat of the coastal regions hundreds of miles to the east. The district covered an area roughly 200 kilometers by 300 kilometers, encompassing dozens of small villages connected by dirt paths that wound through valleys and over ridges like ancient arteries feeding the heart of rural Africa. Each settlement consisted of clusters of traditional huts with walls of mud and wattle, their thatched roofs providing shelter from the brief but intense rains that swept across the highlands during the wet season. The homesteads were surrounded by small fields where families cultivated maize, beans, and other subsistence crops that could thrive in the cool mountain climate. German colonial administrators had established their presence in the late 19th century, building a solid stone administrative block called the Boma in the village of Madandu, near what would eventually become Njombe Town. The structure stood like a fortress against the African sky, its thick walls and narrow windows speaking to both the ambitions and the fears of European rule. After the First World War, when German East Africa became the British Mandate of Tanganyika, the Union Jack replaced the German flag, but the essential character of colonial administration remained unchanged. The British officials who governed the region from their district headquarters understood little of the complex social and spiritual lives of the indigenous Wabena people who called the highlands home. These were the descendants of warriors who had fought against both German and British incursions, who had hidden in the dark caves of Nyumba Nitu during the Maji Maji uprising, and whose traditional beliefs remained deeply rooted in the understanding that the natural and supernatural worlds were inseparably linked. The landscape itself seemed to invite such beliefs. Ancient forests clung to the mountain slopes, their canopies so dense that midday appeared as twilight beneath the trees. Rocky outcroppings rose from the grasslands like sleeping giants, weathered by wind and rain into fantastic shapes that stirred the imagination. Streams carved deep gorges through the red earth, their waters rushing toward distant Lake Nyasa with the sound of constant whispers. In such terrain, it was easy to believe that spirits moved through the shadows, that the boundary between the living and the dead remained forever permeable. The colonial economy of the 1930s depended heavily on the movement of livestock and agricultural products along trading routes that connected the highlands to markets in neighboring territories. Cattle drives moved south toward Malawi and Zambia during the dry season, their progress marked by clouds of red dust that hung in the still air for hours after the herds had passed. The animals represented wealth and security for African families, but they also served the broader economic interests of the British Empire, which sought to extract maximum value from its African territories while maintaining minimal administrative costs. This system of benign neglect worked reasonably well when conditions remained stable. But in the early 1930s, stability began to fracture in ways that no colonial administrator could have anticipated. The crisis began not with lions, but with cattle. Rinderpest, a viral disease that swept through East Africa like wildfire, had devastated livestock populations across the region in the previous decades. The disease killed cattle with ruthless efficiency, wiping out entire herds in a matter of weeks and leaving families without their primary source of wealth and draft power. In some areas, 9 out of every 10 cattle died, transforming communities that had depended on livestock for generations into desperate survivors struggling to rebuild their lives. The British colonial government, determined to prevent the spread of the disease between the territories of Eastern and Southern Africa, implemented an aggressive game control program along the borders with Malawi and Zambia. The policy was simple in conception, but devastating in execution, kill all wild animals that might serve as carriers or reservoirs for the disease. Teams of government hunters moved through the border regions with military precision, shooting zebras, wildebeest, antelope, buffalo, and any other animal that might pose a risk to the cattle trade that formed the economic backbone of colonial enterprise. The program succeeded in its immediate objective of controlling rinderpest, but it created an ecological catastrophe that would have consequences far beyond anything the administrators had imagined. Across thousands of square kilometers of wilderness, the natural prey base that had sustained predators for countless generations simply vanished. Lions, leopards, and hyenas found themselves in a landscape where their traditional food sources had been systematically eliminated by government decree. Most predators died of starvation or moved away in search of prey elsewhere. But in the Njombe district, one pride of lions found a different solution to the crisis. They would learn to hunt humans. The Lions of Njombe were not particularly large or impressive specimens by the standards of their species. Reports from those who eventually encountered them described animals that appeared smaller than typical lions, leaner, and more wiry than the magnificent predators found in game reserves. But what they lacked in size, they compensated for with intelligence, adaptability, and a ruthless efficiency that would make them the most feared animals in the history of East Africa. The pride was led by a one-eyed male whose injury may have contributed to his willingness to experiment with unconventional prey. Traditional lion hunting techniques, developed over millions of years of evolution, were designed for stalking zebras, buffalo, and antelope across open grasslands. But humans presented different challenges and opportunities that required new approaches and strategies. The lions quickly discovered that humans were remarkably easy to kill. Unlike their traditional prey, people could not outrun a charging lion, possessed no horns or hooves for defense, and lacked the thick hides that made larger game animals difficult to dispatch quickly. More importantly, humans followed predictable patterns of behavior that made them vulnerable to ambush. They traveled the same paths at regular times, worked in fields during daylight hours, and gathered in settlements that could be approached under cover of darkness. But the lions also learned that hunting humans required different tactics than hunting traditional prey. Villages were surrounded by thorn fences called bomas that provided some protection against nocturnal raiders. Humans used fire to illuminate their settlements and could organize group defenses when threatened. Most significantly, killing humans brought retaliation that did not accompany hunting zebras or antelope. The pride developed a hunting strategy that overturned conventional understanding of lion behavior. Instead of hunting at night, like most of their species, they began making their kills during daylight hours when humans were dispersed and vulnerable in their fields and gardens. They used the darkness not for hunting, but for traveling up to 20 miles between attacks, appearing suddenly in distant villages where their reputation had not yet spread and defenses had not been prepared. The lions also appeared to use some form of relay system for moving their victims. Witnesses who survived attacks reported seeing lions drag bodies into dense bush where they disappeared completely, despite intensive searches by villagers and colonial officials. Some experts theorized that the pride had developed a coordinated method for passing bodies from one lion to another, allowing them to transport their kills far from the scene of attack, and reducing the likelihood of discovery or retaliation. By 1933, the attacks had begun in earnest. The first kills were isolated incidents that might have been dismissed as normal wildlife encounters in a region where lions had always posed some threat to human settlement. But the attacks quickly escalated in frequency and coordination, spreading across the district in a pattern that defied all conventional understanding of predator behavior. The scale and systematic nature of the attacks soon distinguished the Njombe outbreak from any previous encounter with man-eating lions. Unlike the famous Tsavo man-eaters, which had involved just 2 animals operating for less than a year, the Njombe pride included multiple adults and cubs spanning 3 generations. The attacks continued year after year with relentless persistence, gradually expanding across an area that covered thousands of square kilometers. Villages that had existed peacefully in the highlands for generations found themselves under siege by an enemy that struck without warning and disappeared without trace. Farmers working in their fields during the day would simply vanish, leaving behind only trampled crops and bloodstains on the earth. Children sent to fetch water from streams or collect firewood from nearby forests failed to return home, their fate revealed only by fragments of clothing or small bones discovered weeks later in remote locations. The attacks followed no predictable pattern that might have allowed for effective defense. The lions might strike the same village repeatedly over several days, then disappear for weeks before attacking a settlement 20 miles away. They seem to possess an uncanny ability to identify moments of vulnerability, appearing when men were away on trading journeys or when families were isolated in remote fields during harvest time. The psychological impact of the attacks was as devastating as their physical toll. People throughout the district lived in constant fear, never knowing when or where the lions might appear next. Women refused to work alone in their gardens. Children were kept close to home even during daylight hours, and entire families began sleeping in trees or on elevated platforms to escape ground-level attacks. The normal rhythms of rural life began to collapse under the strain of constant vigilance. Markets that had operated for generations were abandoned when traders refused to risk the journey between villages. Fields went unplanted or unharvested as farmers fled their homes for the safety of larger settlements. Traditional ceremonies and social gatherings were curtailed or eliminated entirely as communities focused on simple survival. The colonial administration initially treated the attacks as a minor wildlife problem that could be resolved through conventional game control methods. District officers issued licenses for local hunters to track and kill the problem animals, confident that a few well-placed shots would end the crisis. But the Lions of Njombe proved far more elusive and intelligent than any normal predators. Local hunters who set out to track the man-eaters found themselves pursuing ghosts. Tracks would appear in one location and disappear completely a few hundred meters later, as if the animals had simply vanished into thin air. Attempts to establish patterns in the attacks failed as the lions shifted their hunting grounds with bewildering unpredictability. Traditional hunting methods that had worked against normal lions proved useless against predators that seemed to understand and adapt to human countermeasures with disturbing intelligence. By 1935, colonial officials were forced to acknowledge that the situation had escalated far beyond their ability to control through routine measures. Reports reaching the district headquarters spoke of more than 40 confirmed deaths, but local sources insisted that the true toll was much higher. Entire families had disappeared without trace, their homesteads found empty with doors torn from their frames and floors, stained with blood that told stories too horrible for official reports. As the death toll mounted and conventional solutions failed, the people of the Njombe district increasingly turned to traditional explanations for the catastrophe that had befallen their communities. The systematic nature of the attacks, the lions' apparent intelligence and coordination, and their ability to evade all attempts at retaliation convinced many villagers that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than ordinary wild animals. The concept of spirit lions was deeply embedded in the traditional worldview of the Wabena people. These were not merely large cats, but supernatural entities controlled by powerful witch doctors who used them to settle disputes, enforce social order, or simply terrorize their enemies. Spirit lions possessed abilities that normal animals lacked, including the power to make themselves invisible, to pass through physical barriers, and to coordinate complex attacks across vast distances. The belief in lycanthropy was equally strong among the highland communities. Certain individuals, usually those with special knowledge of traditional medicine and supernatural forces, were believed to possess the ability to transform themselves into lions at will. These lion men, or Watu Simba, could take human form during the day and animal form at night, allowing them to move freely through communities while planning their attacks. The name of one particular witch doctor began to circulate through the villages with increasing frequency as the attacks continued. Matamula Manhera had once served as a local chief before being removed from office by the colonial authorities for corruption and abuse of power. Many villagers believed that his removal had triggered a supernatural revenge that manifested itself through the man-eating lions. According to local tradition, Matamula possessed the power to control lions through magical means, directing their attacks against those who had wronged him or supported his removal from office. These beliefs were not mere superstition in the context of rural African society. They represented a coherent worldview that provided explanations for events that seemed to defy rational understanding. The lions' intelligence, their coordinated attacks, and their ability to evade all attempts at elimination were easily explained if the animals were controlled by supernatural forces rather than operating according to normal predator instincts. The practical consequences of these beliefs were profound and destructive. Villagers who regarded the lions as spiritual entities controlled by human agents were reluctant to take direct action against them. Attempting to kill spirit lions or lion men could bring even more terrible supernatural retaliation upon the entire community. Traditional protective measures focused on ritual and magic, rather than physical defenses, leaving communities essentially helpless against attacks by very real and very dangerous predators. Some unscrupulous individuals took advantage of the fear and confusion to settle personal scores or eliminate rivals. Operating under cover of the lion attacks, they murdered their enemies and mutilated the bodies to simulate predator kills, further confusing the situation and making it impossible to determine which deaths were caused by actual lions and which were the work of human killers. The belief in supernatural causation also made it extremely difficult for colonial authorities to obtain the cooperation they needed to track and eliminate the man-eating lions. Villagers refused to provide information about lion movements or participate in hunting expeditions, fearing that such actions would anger the witch doctor controlling the animals and bring even greater calamities upon their communities. By the late 1930s, the situation in the Njombe district had deteriorated beyond the point where local authorities could hope to restore order through their own efforts. The attacks were claiming victims at an unprecedented rate. The local population was paralyzed by fear and superstition, and the colonial administration had exhausted its limited resources without making any meaningful progress toward resolving the crisis. It became clear that extraordinary measures would be required to deal with what had become the most serious wildlife problem in the history of British colonial Africa. George Rushby was 40 years old when he received the summons that would make him famous throughout East Africa and beyond. Born in England at the dawn of the 20th century, he had spent most of his adult life in the wild places of Africa, earning his living as an elephant hunter, prospector, farmer, and eventually as a professional game ranger. His reputation for tracking dangerous animals was unmatched in the territory, built through decades of experience in the remote wilderness areas where few Europeans had ever ventured. Rushby had arrived in Africa as a young man with little money and fewer prospects, but he possessed an instinctive understanding of the African bush that could not be taught in any school. He had learned to read animal tracks like written text, to anticipate the behavior of dangerous game, and to survive for weeks at a time in conditions that would defeat most trained soldiers. His knowledge of elephant behavior was particularly renowned, having spent years driving rogue elephants away from African farms and settlements with techniques that relied more on understanding animal psychology than on superior firepower. The man who arrived at the Njombe district headquarters in 1938 was lean and weathered, with the quiet confidence that came from surviving countless encounters with Africa's most dangerous animals. He carried a battered .470 double-barreled rifle that had served him faithfully through years of hunting, and he was accompanied by 2 experienced African trackers whose knowledge of local conditions complemented his own expertise with dangerous game. Rushby's initial assessment of the situation was sobering. During his first meeting with district officials, he learned that the attacks had been continuing for nearly 6 years without any significant reduction in their frequency or severity. Local estimates of the death toll had risen to more than 1,500 people, though the true number would never be known due to the remote locations of many attacks and the reluctance of families to report deaths that might be attributed to supernatural causes. The geographical scope of the problem was equally daunting. The lions were operating across an area larger than many European countries, appearing in locations separated by hundreds of kilometers with no apparent pattern or logic. Conventional tracking methods had failed completely, as the animals seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection and elude pursuit. Most disturbing of all was the complete lack of cooperation from the local population. Villagers who might have provided crucial information about lion movements and attack patterns refused to speak with colonial officials, convinced that the animals were controlled by powerful supernatural forces that would retaliate against anyone who aided their enemies. Without local assistance, even the most experienced hunter would be operating blind in a vast and unfamiliar landscape. Rushby understood immediately that he was facing a challenge unlike any he had encountered in his long career. These were not ordinary problem animals that could be tracked and eliminated through conventional hunting methods. The Lions of Njombe had adapted their behavior to exploit human vulnerabilities with a level of intelligence and coordination that suggested they had developed into something approaching a different subspecies of predator. After weeks of careful observation and analysis, Rushby began to understand the sophisticated hunting strategy that had made the Njombe Pride so successful and so deadly. The lions had essentially reversed the normal predator-prey relationship by making humans as predictable and vulnerable as any herd animal. They had learned to exploit human behavioral patterns with ruthless efficiency, turning the routines of daily life into opportunities for ambush and killing. The pride's use of daylight hunting represented a fundamental adaptation to human behavior that demonstrated remarkable intelligence. Most humans felt secure during daylight hours and let down their guard when working in fields or traveling between villages. They associated danger with darkness and focused their defensive preparations on nighttime protection. By hunting during the day, the lions caught their victims when they were most relaxed and least prepared for attack. The nocturnal travel pattern served multiple purposes beyond simple misdirection. Moving at night allowed the lions to cover vast distances without being observed, appearing in new hunting grounds before word of their presence could spread. It also meant that attacks in one area were followed by a period of apparent safety that lulled residents into believing the danger had passed, making them more vulnerable when the lions returned weeks or months later. The relay system for moving bodies remained the most mysterious aspect of the lions' behavior. Rushby theorized that the pride had developed a coordinated method for transporting kills to feeding sites far from the locations of attacks. This would explain why human remains were rarely found near attack sites, despite intensive searches by families and colonial officials. The system also minimized the risk of discovery and retaliation by ensuring that evidence of kills was quickly removed from populated areas. The lions had also learned to identify and exploit moments of maximum human vulnerability. They showed a remarkable ability to detect when villages were undermanned due to trading expeditions or seasonal migrations. They seemed to know when families were isolated in remote fields during planting or harvest seasons. Most disturbing of all, they appeared to target children and women preferentially, perhaps recognizing that these victims were less likely to mount effective resistance and more likely to provoke panic in their communities. Rushby realized that conventional hunting tactics would be useless against such intelligent adversaries. The lions had clearly learned to recognize and avoid traditional hunting patterns, disappearing whenever organized expeditions appeared in their territories. They had adapted to human countermeasures with a speed and efficiency that suggested they were constantly learning from each encounter with their would-be hunters. The game warden would need to develop entirely new approaches that could match the lion's intelligence and adaptability. This would require not just hunting skill, but strategic thinking that anticipated and countered the predator's evolved tactics. Most importantly, it would require patience and persistence that could outlast animals that had already demonstrated their ability to sustain a campaign of terror for nearly a decade. Rushby's first step was to establish a series of observation posts throughout the district that could provide early warning of lion movements and attacks. He positioned his 2 African trackers at strategic locations where they could monitor game trails and water sources while remaining in communication through a network of runners and signal fires. This system would allow him to respond more quickly to reports of attacks and potentially intercept the lions while they were still in the vicinity of kills. The game warden also began a systematic study of attack patterns, mapping every reported incident onto detailed charts that revealed subtle trends invisible to casual observation. He discovered that the lions showed a slight preference for certain types of terrain and tended to avoid areas with dense human settlement during certain seasons. These patterns were weak and often contradicted by subsequent events, but they provided the first hints of predictable behavior that might be exploited. Most importantly, Rushby began to establish credibility with local communities through patient demonstration that the man-eating lions were indeed mortal animals rather than supernatural entities. He achieved this by tracking down and killing several normal lions in the district, displaying their bodies in village centers where people could examine them and verify that they were composed of flesh and blood rather than magical substance. These demonstrations had a gradual but significant impact on local attitudes. While most villagers continued to believe that the man-eaters were controlled by supernatural forces, they began to accept that the animals themselves were vulnerable to conventional weapons. This distinction opened the door for limited cooperation in tracking and intelligence-gathering activities. Rushby's hunting strategy relied heavily on a combination of gin traps and carefully positioned ambush sites. Gin traps were steel devices with powerful spring-loaded jaws that could break the leg of any animal large enough to trigger them. The game warden buried these traps along game trails and paths leading to water sources, covering them with dust and leaves to create invisible hazards that would cripple any lion that stepped on them. The ambush sites were built around tethered goats that served as bait to attract the lions within rifle range. Rushby constructed these positions near water sources and along known travel routes, building elevated platforms in large trees that provided concealment and protection while offering clear fields of fire. The goats were secured within thorn fences that would contain them while allowing the scent to carry for miles across the landscape. The waiting required extraordinary patience and endurance. Rushby would climb into his platform before dusk and remain motionless for hours, watching and listening for any sign of approaching lions. The slightest movement or sound could alert the intelligent predators to his presence and ruin any chance of a successful ambush. On most nights, nothing happened. The bait was ignored, the traps remained unsprung, and dawn arrived without any contact with the man-eaters. But occasionally, the strategy worked. Rushby's first success came after 3 months of patient preparation and countless hours of fruitless waiting. The contact occurred at an ambush site near a seasonal stream where lion tracks had been reported by local herders. The game warden had been in position since before sunset, watching his tethered goat through the iron sights of his .470 rifle while the African darkness deepened around his tree platform. The lions appeared with shocking suddenness just after midnight, materializing from the shadows like deadly ghosts. Rushby counted at least 4 adults moving with the coordinated precision that had made them so effective at hunting humans. They approached the bait with obvious wariness, testing the air for scents that might indicate danger while maintaining formations that allowed for rapid escape if threatened. The shot that broke the night silence was followed immediately by the roar of a wounded lion and the sound of heavy bodies crashing through the undergrowth. Rushby had aimed for the largest male, placing his bullet precisely behind the front shoulder where it would penetrate the heart and lungs for a quick kill. But lions were notoriously difficult to stop with a single shot, and wounded predators were among the most dangerous animals in Africa. Dawn revealed blood trails leading in multiple directions from the ambush site. Rushby and his trackers followed the heaviest trail through dense bush for nearly 2 kilometers before discovering the body of a large male lion lying beneath a cluster of thorn trees. The animal was smaller than typical lions, but showed the lean musculature and scarred hide that spoke of a life spent in constant conflict and hunting. The dead lion was transported back to the nearest village, where its display had precisely the impact Rushby had hoped to achieve. Hundreds of people gathered to examine the carcass, touching the fur and claws to verify that it was indeed composed of ordinary animal material rather than supernatural substance. For the first time in years, villagers began to speak openly about lion sightings and attacks, providing information that would prove crucial to future hunting efforts. But the death of one lion, even a large male, represented only a minor victory against a pride that included at least 14 other individuals. The surviving lions quickly adapted to the new threat by becoming even more cautious and unpredictable in their movements. They began to avoid the water sources and travel routes where Rushby had positioned his traps and ambush sites, forcing him to constantly relocate his equipment and develop new strategies. The attacks continued with undiminished intensity, suggesting that the pride's hunting organization was not dependent on any single individual. The death of the male leader had been absorbed without any disruption to their systematic predation on human communities throughout the district. The war between George Rushby and the Lions of Njombe stretched across nearly 5 years of patient hunting, tactical innovation, and gradual attrition. Each success was followed by periods of frustration as the surviving lions learned from their encounters with their human hunter and adapted their behavior to avoid his traps and ambush sites. Rushby's second kill came 6 months after his first, when Gintraps finally claimed a female that had been careless enough to step on concealed steel jaws while approaching a water source. The trap had shattered her leg, leaving her unable to hunt effectively or keep pace with the rest of the pride. Rushby tracked her for 2 days through difficult terrain before finding her sheltered beneath a rocky overhang, where a single shot ended her suffering. The third lion fell to a carefully orchestrated ambush that required weeks of preparation. Rushby had noticed that the pride showed a slight tendency to revisit successful hunting grounds after intervals of several months. By analyzing attack patterns and mapping the locations of previous kills, he identified a small valley where multiple attacks had occurred over the past 2 years. He established a permanent observation post overlooking the valley and waited with the patience of a professional predator. When the lions finally returned, they found the game warden waiting with his rifle and 2 African assistants armed with additional firearms. The coordinated volley claimed 2 animals, though the survivors escaped into thick brush that made immediate pursuit impossible. The bodies recovered the following morning included a mature female and a half-grown cub, reducing the pride's strength to 11 individuals. Each kill required enormous expenditure of time and resources that strained the limited budget available for game control operations. Rushby and his assistants spent weeks in the field, For every successful contact with the man-eating lions, consuming supplies, and wearing out equipment at rates that made the campaign increasingly expensive. Colonial administrators began to question whether the costs were justified by the results, particularly given the apparent inability to bring the crisis to a rapid conclusion. The lions' continued adaptation to hunting pressure also meant that successful tactics quickly became ineffective as the animals learned to avoid previously dangerous situations. Gin traps that had been successful in the early stages of the campaign were ignored by lions that had learned to detect and avoid the concealed steel jaws. Ambush sites that had produced kills were never revisited by predators that seemed to possess perfect memory for dangerous locations. Rushby was forced to constantly innovate and experiment with new approaches that stayed ahead of the lion's learning curve. He began using different types of bait, from domestic animals to carefully aged carrion, that might appeal to scavenging instincts. He experimented with various trap designs and placement techniques that might catch lions that had learned to avoid his standard methods. Most importantly, he worked to expand his network of local informants who could provide real-time intelligence about lion movements and attack patterns. The breakthrough came when Rushby finally gained the confidence of local communities through his patient demonstrations of success against the man-eater. Villagers who had previously refused all cooperation began to provide detailed reports of lion sightings and attacks, allowing him to respond more quickly to opportunities and position his resources more effectively. By 1943, the cumulative impact of Rushby's campaign was finally beginning to show results. The pride that had once numbered 15 individuals had been reduced to fewer than 8 animals, and their hunting efficiency had declined noticeably as their numbers dwindled. The loss of experienced adults meant that younger lions were forced into hunting roles before they had fully mastered the sophisticated techniques that had made the pride so successful. The surviving lions also showed signs of increasing desperation that made them more vulnerable to hunting pressure. Attacks became more frequent but less coordinated, suggesting that the animals were having difficulty finding sufficient prey to sustain their remaining numbers. They began to take greater risks, approaching human settlements more closely and remaining in hunting areas for longer periods that increased their chances of detection. Rushby exploited these developments by intensifying his campaign and positioning resources to take advantage of the lions' changing behavior. He established permanent observation posts near the communities most frequently targeted by attack, allowing for rapid response when the predators appeared. He also began using packs of specially trained hunting dogs that could track lions more effectively than human trackers and provide early warning of approaching danger. The dogs proved particularly effective at locating lions that had been wounded by gin traps or gunfire but had escaped immediate pursuit. Their superior scenting ability allowed Rushby to follow blood trails that would have been impossible for humans to detect, leading to the recovery of several lions that might otherwise have died slowly in remote locations. The psychological impact of consistent success against the man-eaters was equally important in turning the tide of the campaign. Local communities that had lived in terror for more than a decade began to believe that the crisis might finally be approaching its end. This growing confidence translated into increased cooperation with hunting efforts and better intelligence about lion movements and attack patterns. Religious and traditional leaders who had previously attributed the attacks to supernatural causes began to acknowledge that the lions were mortal animals vulnerable to conventional weapons. This shift in understanding undermined the spiritual authority that had protected the pride from community resistance and made it possible for villagers to take more active roles in their own defense. The colonial administration also began to provide additional resources for the hunting campaign as reports of success filtered back to district headquarters. Additional ammunition, traps, and supplies were allocated to support Rushby's efforts, while administrative pressure for rapid results was reduced in recognition of the unique challenges posed by the man-eating pride. The last phase of the campaign against the Lions of Njombe was characterized by increasingly sophisticated tactics as Rushby closed in on the surviving members of the pride. The remaining lions had learned to avoid most conventional hunting methods and required innovative approaches that anticipated their adaptive behavior. Rushby's most successful innovation during this period was the development of coordinated hunting drives that used large numbers of local volunteers to systematically search terrain where lions were believed to be hiding. These operations required careful planning and execution to avoid endangering the civilian participants while maintaining enough pressure to force the lions into areas where they could be engaged effectively. The drives were organized around natural terrain features that channeled movement toward predetermined killing zones where Rushby and his armed assistants waited with rifles ready. Local participants used drums, shouts, and controlled fires to move lions through the landscape without coming into direct contact with the dangerous predators. The technique proved highly effective against lions that had learned to avoid static ambush sites and concealed traps. The constant movement and noise made it impossible for the animals to rely on stealth and patience, forcing them into reactive behavior that played to Rushby's advantages as a professional hunter. The seventh lion fell to a coordinated drive operation in early 1944, when a mature female was forced from thick cover into an open area where she could be shot cleanly. The eighth and ninth lions were killed during a single operation later that year, when a well-organized drive succeeded in locating the remaining members of the Pride sheltering in a rocky canyon that had previously served as their refuge. Each success made subsequent operations more difficult, as the surviving lions became increasingly wary and unpredictable. The final animals were the most intelligent and adaptable members of the original Pride, individuals that had survived years of hunting pressure through superior wariness and tactical flexibility. The penultimate kill required nearly 6 months of patient tracking and planning. Rushby had identified a single female that appeared to be the last surviving adult member of the Pride, accompanied by what appeared to be 2 young cubs or juveniles. The family group had learned to avoid all conventional hunting methods and moved across the landscape with the wariness of animals that understood they were being hunted. The final confrontation took place in rugged terrain near the border with neighboring districts, where the surviving lions had retreated as hunting pressure intensified in their traditional territories. Rushby and a team of experienced trackers pursued them through difficult country for several days before finally cornering them in a rocky gorge where escape routes were limited. The 3 animals made their final stand among the boulders and thorn scrub that choked the floor of the gorge. The adult female charged when she realized that retreat was impossible, covering nearly 50 meters of rough ground before Rushby's rifle brought her down. The 2 juveniles were killed moments later as they attempted to flee up the steep walls of their rocky prison. The death of the last members of the man-eating Pride in late 1947 marked the end of the most sustained and deadly wildlife crisis in the history of East Africa. After 15 years of systematic predation that had claimed as many as 1,500 human lives, the Highlands of Njombe district were finally safe from the terror that had dominated every aspect of daily life for an entire generation. George Rushby's final tally included 15 lions killed through a combination of rifle fire, gin traps, and coordinated hunting drives. The campaign had required nearly 5 years of dedicated effort and consumed resources that strained the limited budget available for game control operations. But the results spoke for themselves. The most dangerous man-eating Pride in recorded history had been completely eliminated. The immediate impact on local communities was profound and transformative. Families that had lived in constant fear for years emerged from their defensive positions and began to reclaim the normal rhythms of rural life. Fields that had been abandoned due to lion attacks were replanted and cultivated. Markets and trading networks that had been disrupted by the crisis gradually resumed operation as people regained confidence in their ability to travel safely between villages. Children who had grown up knowing only terror and restriction experienced freedom of movement for the first time in their lives. Women returned to their traditional roles as farmers and gatherers, working in fields and forests without the constant anxiety that had characterized the previous decade and a half. The psychological healing took longer than the physical recovery. Many villagers continued to regard certain areas as dangerous long after the last lions had been killed, and rumors of supernatural predators persisted for years in remote communities where traditional beliefs remained strong. But the visible evidence of success gradually overcame these lingering fears as life returned to normal without further attack. The colonial administration declared victory over what had become one of the most serious challenges to British authority in the territory. District officials who had struggled with the crisis for years finally had positive results to report to their superiors, while the broader colonial government used the successful campaign as evidence of its ability to protect African populations from natural disasters and emergency. But the local population attributed their salvation not to Rushby's hunting skills or colonial intervention, but to the supernatural powers of traditional authority figures who had allegedly negotiated peace with the spirit forces responsible for the attacks. The deposed chief Matamula Mangera was quietly reinstated to his traditional position, and many villagers believed that his restoration to power had been the decisive factor in ending the lion attacks. This interpretation reflected the persistent strength of traditional worldviews that continued to shape African understanding of events that seemed to transcend normal experience. The man-eating lions had been so intelligent, so coordinated, and so persistent that many people could not accept purely naturalistic explanations for their behavior and ultimate defeat. The Lions of Njombe left a legacy that extended far beyond their immediate impact on the communities they terrorized for 15 years. The crisis became a case study in the complex interactions between ecological disruption, colonial policy, traditional belief systems, and wildlife management that would influence approaches to human-wildlife conflict throughout Africa for generations to come. The ecological lessons were perhaps the most important for future conservation efforts. The Rinderpest control program that eliminated the lion's natural prey base demonstrated the unintended consequences of large-scale environmental interventions undertaken without adequate understanding of ecosystem dynamics. The systematic elimination of wild herbivores created conditions that forced predators to seek alternative prey sources, with catastrophic results for human communities. Future wildlife management programs would need to consider these broader ecological relationships and develop strategies that maintained natural predator-prey balances while achieving specific disease control objectives. The Njombe crisis became a cautionary tale about the dangers of single-minded approaches to environmental management that ignored the complex web of relationships linking different species and human communities. The anthropological dimensions of the crisis also provided important insights into the role of traditional belief systems in shaping responses to environmental challenges. The widespread conviction that the lions were controlled by supernatural forces had made it virtually impossible for colonial authorities to organize effective countermeasures until local attitudes began to change through direct demonstration of success against the man-eaters. This pattern would be repeated in numerous subsequent wildlife conflicts throughout Africa, where traditional explanations for animal behavior often conflicted with scientific understanding and hindered efforts to develop effective management strategies. The Njombe case demonstrated the critical importance of working with local communities and respecting traditional knowledge while providing evidence-based alternatives to supernatural interpretations. The crisis also highlighted the limitations of colonial administrative systems that lacked the resources and local knowledge necessary to respond effectively to complex environmental emergencies. The 15-year duration of the lion attacks reflected not just the intelligence and adaptability of the predators, but also the inability of colonial authorities to mobilize adequate resources for addressing a problem that affected primarily African populations in remote rural areas. George Rushby became a legendary figure in East African folklore, celebrated as the man who had eliminated the most dangerous predators in the region's history. His patient, methodical approach to hunting the man-eaters established principles of wildlife management that would influence professional practice for decades to come. His emphasis on understanding animal behavior, working with local communities, and adapting tactics to match the intelligence of his quarry became standard elements of advanced game management. But Rushby himself understood that his success had depended on factors beyond individual skill or determination. The campaign against the Njombe lions had succeeded only because of gradually increasing cooperation from local communities, adequate resources from colonial authorities, and the cumulative impact of sustained effort over many years. Any one of these factors might have been insufficient to achieve victory against such formidable adversaries. The story of the Lions of Njombe serves as a powerful reminder of the complex relationships between human societies and the natural world, particularly in contexts where ecological disruption creates conditions for conflict and tragedy. The crisis that unfolded in the highlands of Tanganyika during the 1930s and 1940s was not simply a wildlife problem, but a multifaceted disaster that revealed fundamental tensions between traditional and modern worldviews, between local knowledge and colonial authority, and between short-term solutions and long-term ecological stability. The man-eating lions themselves were products of human interference with natural systems, forced into abnormal behavior by the systematic elimination of their traditional prey base. Their remarkable intelligence and adaptability allowed them to survive and thrive in circumstances that would have defeated less flexible predators, but these same qualities made them extraordinarily dangerous to human populations that lacked effective means of defense. The 15-year duration of the crisis reflected not just the lions' formidable capabilities, but also the complex social and political factors that delayed effective intervention. Traditional beliefs about supernatural causation prevented local communities from taking direct action against the predators, while colonial administrative priorities focused resources on economic development rather than rural security. The combination of these factors created conditions that allowed a relatively small number of lions to terrorize an entire district for more than a decade. George Rushby's eventual success in eliminating the man-eating pride represented a triumph of patience, skill, and systematic methodology over seemingly impossible odds. But his campaign also demonstrated the enormous costs associated with addressing wildlife conflicts after they have escalated to crisis level. The resources required to hunt down 15 intelligent predators across thousands of square kilometers of difficult terrain far exceeded the investments that might have prevented the crisis through better initial management of the Rinderpest Control Program. The human toll of the Njombe lions may never be accurately calculated. The official estimate of 1,500 deaths represents one of the highest casualty figures ever recorded for wildlife attacks, but the true impact extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire communities lived in fear for a generation, children grew up without normal childhood experiences, and economic development was severely hampered by the constant threat of predation. The psychological and cultural trauma inflicted by the crisis also had lasting effects that continued long after the last lions were killed. Traditional social structures were disrupted by the constant threat of death. Religious and spiritual practices were affected by the need to explain unprecedented levels of predation, and confidence in both traditional and colonial authority was undermined by the apparent inability to provide effective protection. Yet the story also demonstrates the remarkable resilience of human communities faced with extraordinary challenges. Despite years of terror and loss, the people of Njombe district maintained their cultural identity and social cohesion while adapting to circumstances that would have broken less resilient societies. Their ultimate survival and recovery from the crisis stands as testimony to the strength of traditional African communities in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity. The Lions of Njombe remain unique in the annals of human-wildlife conflict, representing an extreme example of what can occur when ecological disruption, human vulnerability, and animal intelligence converge in circumstances that overwhelm normal systems of control and management. Their story serves as both historical record and cautionary tale, reminding us that the relationships between human societies and the natural world are far more complex and potentially dangerous than our modern separation from wilderness might suggest. In the remote highlands of southern Tanzania, where the winds still blow across the grasslands and forests where terror once reigned, the legacy of the man-eating lions continues to shape local understanding of the delicate balance between human ambition and natural forces. The memory of those 15 deadly years serves as a permanent reminder that humanity's dominion over the natural world is neither complete nor secure, and that the consequences of ecological disruption can be both unexpected and catastrophic. The hunting chronicle of the Lions of Njombe thus stands not only as an extraordinary tale of human courage and persistence in the face of mortal danger, but as a complex meditation on the relationship between civilization and wilderness, between traditional wisdom and colonial authority, and between the intended and unintended consequences of human intervention in the natural world. It remains, above all, a story of survival against odds that seemed impossible, achieved through the combined efforts of all who refused to surrender their homeland to the predators that had claimed it as their hunting ground.